Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending this morning's launch of our Future-Proofing Cities. My name is David Tonkin. I look after Atkins in the UK, and I'm delighted to present the report that we've worked closely on with our partners from the Department of International Development and the University College London. The format for this morning is that I'll do a little brief introduction, some of my own views, having spent an interesting couple of nights reading through the report, and just my comments and insights on the joint work that we've done. And then we'll invite a couple of the people who have actually done a lot of the detailed work to come to the stage and just take some questions from the audience. We're aiming to finish off at about 12, and be delighted if you want to stay and just have a little bite of lunch. I think we have a drop-dead time of 12:30. We have to be out, so we must be away by then. So first of all, just a couple of reflections from myself. It's very clear that the challenge we face as a race are clearly documented and reported. We're focusing and we're facing on continued significant growth in world population. It's projected that within 40 years, that 75% of our world population will live in our cities, and that's well within our current planning frameworks. It's predicted nearly 4.6 billion of our population will be resident in already rapidly growing Asian and African cities. This increasing urbanization provides profound challenges for governments, for policymakers, for cities and for planning authorities. It's clear that the cities need to take steps now to future-proof themselves, to ensure that their development is planned to accommodate the range of environmental, social and economic challenges. The sooner they act, the easier it will be to steer away from unsuitable and unsustainable development paths. It really isn't an option to grow first and to work out the problems later. Future-proofing is about utilising and developing the capabilities of cities to respond to the risks associated with climate change, resource scarcity, and damage to ecosystems in a way that catalyses inclusive and holistic urban development. This report, I believe, provides a practical and specific input into the approach cities can adopt. The report at its core has an integrated assessment of risks, vulnerabilities, and capacities of 129 cities across 20 countries spanning Asia and Africa. We have jointly developed an urban risk database allowing us to understand the multiple and key interconnected risks facing cities from climate hazards, resource scarcity, and damage to ecosystems. Cities understanding their risk profiles and vulnerabilities, particular to their individual situation, can start to future-proof their development. The report identifies over 100 policy options, identifying which policies are most suitable to different city types. It looks at how to integrate these policies, so mitigating a range of risks and delivering wider social and economic benefits. By understanding and responding to risks appropriately, cities can grasp opportunities and help reduce their costs and boost benefits for all the people that live within the cities. Finally, for me, it's clear that understanding that responding to these challenges requires integrated, multidisciplinary skills. The challenges of responding to multiple risks and opportunities with integrated policies requires integrated multidisciplinary teams that can understand the interconnections and the trade-offs required. Skills need to be leveraged across infrastructure, engineering, environment, planning, architecture, economics, and the social sciences. Through our broad range of experience of working across all these disciplines and working in cities around the world, we understand those complexities and the opportunities that can be created. I think we're ideally placed to help cities think through the challenges and opportunities that face them. Now, I think we believe that this report steps forward thinking at a important practical evidence level of what can be done to future-proof our cities to cope with the increasing urbanisation and associated social, economic and environmental challenges. So that's my sort of initial thoughts. I'll hand over now to Professor Tim Wheeler, Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for International Development, just to get his perspective.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be at the launch of this innovative report today representing DFID. This is clearly a unique piece of research funded from DFID's Policy Research Fund that I oversee, and undertaken by a private sector academic partnership between Atkins and University College London. The Department for International Development is keen on developing our thinking with strong influences from the private sector, citizens, and academic perspectives. Other speakers today will cite how more than half of the world already live in urban areas, and this will increase to 75% by the year 2050. And 95% of this growth will be in developing countries. South Asia and sub-Saharan African populations will double in that time. Urbanization will become a key driver for change, for poverty reduction, for growth, and for the environment, and it will no doubt influence our work in many of our countries. And only yesterday, I was on the panel with the government chief scientist, Sir John Beddington, at the launch of the Foresight report on the anticipation of disasters, and there was a very strong urban theme to that report. The future-proofing report that we have in front of us makes a powerful case for cities to act now to deal with the interconnected climate and environmental risks facing cities. It introduces the idea of future-proofing, which is about cities looking in an integrated way at the risks they face and developing solutions that can catalyze inclusive urban development. Cities face significant risks from climate change, from resource scarcities, and from damage to vital ecosystems. And these risks cannot be looked at in isolation. They are multiple, they are interlinked, and they are growing. Cities in the developing world, which still have significant numbers of people living in poverty, are particularly vulnerable to these risks. There is an opportunity here which the report highlights. Much of the urban infrastructure in the developing world is yet to be built. The scale and pace at which cities in the developing world are changing provides an opportunity for cities to grow in ways in which minimize the future economic impacts associated with different environmental risks and which can also improve the lives of poor people. This report, I think, offers a new methodology that will enable city-level decision-makers to think through the risks they face and to act now to future-proof their cities. It will also provide a platform for DFID officials and other development actors to have an open dialogue with city-level decision-makers. So DFID's thinking on urbanization is evolving. We welcome this report, and we'll be considering how the report and other evidence on urbanization reflects on our policy and our programming work. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Now I'll hand over to Professor Yvonne Riadh, Director of University College London Environment Institute.
Good morning, everybody. I'm here on behalf of the Office for the Vice Provost for Research, and I just want to tell you how this fits into UCL's approach to dealing with the problems that we face today. And I'm heartened to hear there's a lot of overlap with both Atkins and DFID thinking on this, which is just we must all be on the right path, or the wrong one. As has been emphasised, the world faces huge problems today, economic, social and environmental problems. These problems are often termed wicked problems or complex problems, and that requires a very particular way of addressing them. And the key to that is, as has already been alluded to, multidisciplinarity. UCL is committed to using its education, its research and its public engagement activities to tackle these kind of problems. And it has put particular emphasis on the ways that it can bring together the large number of different disciplines working within UCL to provide new analyses and to suggest new pathways and new solutions. The key platform for doing that at UCL is through its Grand Challenges programme. UCL identified some years ago 4 grand challenges where it wanted to make a distinctive difference and hopefully contribute to solutions through a research-led approach. It talks about transforming a research into knowledge and into wisdom that enables these challenges to be dealt with. The 4 challenges are global health, and UCL has an Institute for Global Health and has was a few years ago influential in producing a Lancet Commission on the health impacts of climate change, the insights of which overlap with his message about the need to future-proof cities. So that's the first one. The second is sustainable cities, which again this one feeds very clearly into. The third is intercultural interactions and how they can be fostered in a tension-ridden world. And lastly, human well-being, trying to feed into the agenda that moves away from straightforward economic growth to a broader sense of well-being as the basis for our actions and decision-making. The Development Planning Unit, which is the co-author of this report, has made a major contribution to these grand challenges, particularly to the grand challenge for sustainable cities that I think this report fits well within. In particular, I would mention the work that Adriana Allen, who you'll be hearing later, has been making on urban metabolism thinking, and also the involvement of one of her colleagues, Julio Davila, who was involved in a second Lancet report, Shaping Cities for Health. This beautifully produced, I think very innovatively produced report is clearly another important example of both UCL and DPU's interdisciplinary research practice. And I hope it will contribute to addressing what is a major global issue, in this case, how to future-proof our cities to make them more truly sustainable. I know that the Vice Provost for Research is delighted to see it's launched, and on behalf of UCL, I commend it to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Yvonne and Tim, thank you. I think you're deposed now. And we'll invite Nick Godfrey, Principal Economist and Lead Author for Atkins, and Adriana Allen, Director of Environmental Justice, Urbanisation and Resilience Programme for the UCL. Now, delighted to have, we've got nameplates as well, excellent. Delighted to have them to come and join me because they have put a considerable amount of work into this report, and we'll be fascinated to hear some of your thoughts. So perhaps I could ask Nick just to open up.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the introduction. As David mentioned, my name's Nick Godfrey. I'm a Principal Economist at Atkins in our Futures team, which has been set up to think through long-term challenges in relation to climate change, natural resource depletion, and protection of vital ecosystems. I think before we move into the Q&A, I think it's worth just underscoring and reiterating some of the key points that David, Tim, and Yvonne have mentioned. The report covers a lot of ground. It's a hugely detailed report, and you'll need some time to digest it. But really, it's essentially about three things. I mean, firstly, cities in developing countries need to take proactive steps, and they need to take proactive steps now to future-proof themselves. The report covers and assesses the environmental risks facing 129 cities spanning 20 countries across South Asia and across Africa. And now what we find is the majority of those cities face multiple environmental risks, from climate change, from energy use, carbon, from threats to water security and food security, etc. And actually what we find is very few cities have a low-risk profile. In addition to that, many of the cities across the developing world are highly vulnerable to environmental risks. So, for example, across the cities that we assessed, over 150 million people live in acute poverty. Now, those are people that are living in some of the poor quality housing. Those are people that are living in some of the most precarious locations. And those people are highly vulnerable to the effects of flooding, to cyclone activities, to rises in the price of energy and food prices, because they spend a huge proportion of their income and salaries on those things. And so there's an important but closing window of opportunity for these cities to act. When I say important but closing, what I mean by that is the cities that we assessed house over 350 million people, or over 5% of the world's population. But those cities, over the next 15 years alone, the population of those cities is due to rise to over 500 million people. And in terms of GDP is due to rise from $2.5 trillion to over 7.1 in the next 15 years alone. That is absolutely massive growth. I mean, if you look at Delhi and Mumbai alone, by 2025, they'll have 50 million people. That's the population of England or the population of South Africa. Massive, massive growth. So there's an opportunity for those cities to invest now and to avoid locking themselves into unsuitable and unsustainable urban infrastructure, because much of the urban infrastructure in those cities is yet to be built, as Tim mentioned. I think a second point the report makes is that cities can act to future-proof themselves, and actually acting can generate social and economic benefits as well as environmental ones. So the report outlines over 100 policies for future-proofing, and that spans a whole multitude of different sectors, from integrated urban planning to diversifying economies away from climate-sensitive sectors, to sustainable transport, renewable energy, managing water supplies effectively, and investing in the built environment and designing buildings in the right way. And what we find is many of the policies for future-proofing can generate wider benefits in terms of social and economic ones. A recent study on Delhi, for example, has suggested that if Delhi was to follow a low-carbon trajectory, that would save up to 12,000 lives per annum by 2030, from improved air quality, from reducing fatalities. I mean, we already see in cities all around the world that many cities, over 4% of GDP per annum is expended due to the costs of congestion and lost productivity. And what we find also, I mean, one of the surprising things that came out of the report was really that many cities are already acting. The report looks at Bangalore and what Bangalore has been doing in terms of introducing a new metro system and a congestion reduction system to reduce energy use, carbon emissions, and improve mobility. We have Maputo investing in coastal defences, Karachi in groundwater conservation. So cities are already doing a lot. And the final point that the report makes is really this issue of responding to complex challenges. Responding to complex challenges and acting to future-proof requires an integrated, multidisciplinary and multi-skilled approach. So it's not useful to continue to look at these issues in silos. On the ground and in cities, city authorities and stakeholders don't look at these issues in silos. And actually, there's an opportunity for many interventions to respond to multiple environmental risks. So, for example, Bangalore is investing in innovative building design that can not only reduce carbon emissions and energy use, but can also protect buildings from the impacts of climate change and conserve water use. So the report shows that we need to break out of our silos and create integrated solutions and packages of measures. And as David mentioned, that is about pooling our skills, and that requires skills from engineers, environmentalists, climate scientists, ecologists, planners, architects, etc. And so just to wrap up, I just draw everyone's attention really to some of the main recommendations in the report. I mean, yes, we do need to support cities to better understand the risks they're facing. Yes, we need to help them develop integrated future-proofing strategies, but we also need to make sure that the resources are available to help them do that. Thank you. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Adriana Allen, who's been one of our close partners working on the report from University College London, to make a few remarks.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to all for joining us this morning. Yes, I was very pleased to be part of the UCL Development Planning Unit team that supported DFID and Atkins in the elaboration of this report. I think that Nick has already covered the three main contributions of future-proofing cities in a very eloquent way, in a way that is also populated by very, very important facts. But before we open the floor for questions, which we will do very soon, I would like to highlight a number of additional key messages that I think are quite valuable within the report. To start with, I will appeal to your memory. I think that some of you might be old enough to remember the work of Polish economist Ignacy Sarr. Back in the 70s, he was very instrumental in developing and popularizing the notion of eco-development. And in doing that, he argued that not only the natural, but also the social and cultural diversity of the world rejects the possibility of a single development path. And I think that there is a very interesting parallel with what future-proofing cities says, in the sense that I think that one of the key messages of the report is that although most cities in the global south face common and mounting environmental challenges, their social, cultural, political, and economic diversity reject the possibility of following a single path to address such risks. In that sense, I feel that the report doesn't fall into the common trap of painting just a doom and gloom scenario, neither in the trap of ignoring the need to act now to prevent future regrets. As argued by Nick, many cities are already acting in the right direction to future-proof themselves. He mentioned the case and the very interesting measures that are being, for instance, adopted in the case of Bangalore, ranging from a new metro system all the way to a very interesting congestion reduction system. But if we take other cities like Maputo, for instance, it is interesting to see that the key in the approach adopted by many of those cities appears to be in the combination of different measures. Say, for instance, in the case of Maputo, Maputo is not just building its coastal defenses to deal with significant climate hazard risks, but it's also upgrading in a very serious way its informal settlements. In the same way, if we look at the case of Karachi, we will see that measures connected to the protection of groundwater, the harvesting of grey water, and the promotion of urban agriculture are all coming together to make sure that the city doesn't have a disruption in terms of its key food and water systems. The report contains a diagram in page 105. So if you don't read it all, at least look at that page. I think there are many more pages worth going through. But I'm calling you to look at that one because I just think that it shows, in a very interesting way, it shows the potential impact of the over 100 policies that have been assessed. And if you have a close look at that diagram, I think that one of the most interesting findings is that it reveals that the policies with the highest potential impact to proof cities do not necessarily require always large infrastructural investments, but wise investments and inclusive decision making. And I think that these two factors are very, very key in thinking through how we combine different policy options. To sum up, I think that the main contribution of this report is that it provides an accessible yet nuanced framework to assess not only the multiple environmental risks faced by cities in the developing world, but also the different degrees of vulnerability affecting their citizens. And this is quite rare to find not only emphasis, again, on the environmental challenges per se, but also on the diversity of situations affecting concrete people, and affecting people in a different way. I think that it is important to highlight as well that this framework not only paves the way to better understand issues of risk and vulnerability, but also to act upon them. And the report does that through two key notions. The idea that we need to tailor the decision and the design of policy portfolios in relation to the capacity to act, the differential capacity to act of different cities, and also that this will probably take us through very different trajectories of change. Some might be very fast, others might be much more gradual. To conclude and to open the floor for questions, I would just like to highlight that future-proofing cannot be done at the expense of fundamental equity concerns, but needs to be rooted in solutions that work for the urban poor now and into the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Right, we now have an opportunity for a few questions. So anybody like to shoot first? Yes.
Me. Hold on, I'll just come over to you because we're recording, so...
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have two questions. One, I'm sure you'll deal with very quickly, which is I noticed that you don't deal with the Asian country which has the largest urbanization program in the world, namely China, and I wondered why that was. And secondly, I noticed there's a tension in thinking about cities between cities as a self-contained entity and cities as dependent on their wider environment, particularly if you're looking at environmental vulnerability. Delta cities, for instance, can be affected by hydroelectric projects 1,000 miles upstream. Mm-hmm. And was there any, I wondered how you approached that issue, whilst one can see that there's a great deal that can be done within cities in terms of integrated solutions, but nevertheless the city is not a self-contained unit. So I just wondered how you resolve those issues.
Okay, well, I should have said, actually, we've got a few people in the audience as well, as we can also throw some questions around with. So who wants to tackle the China one first?
Happy to answer the China one. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, we cover 129 cities spanning 20 countries. The approach outlined in the report is more widely applicable to countries such as China, etc. And we are looking for ways to potentially extend the approach moving forward. This was really a pilot project to act as a starting point, and the cities that we assessed were those that are within DFID's country footprint, and they're cities which have populations in excess of 750,000 people to allow for comparable population data and other available data. Does that answer your question?
DFID no longer works in China, is it a major factor? Or
well, it includes cities within DFID's country footprint. Yeah. In relation to your second question, in terms of looking at impacts outside cities, if I understand your question correctly, what we look at in the report is we do look at not only cities themselves and the environmental risks facing them, so for example flooding, etc. We also look at risks within a city's broader urban catchment. So we look at issues in relation to water scarcity, we look at issues in relation to food security, and the potential that cities which are growing rapidly, for example in the Congo Basin, there's numerous cities which sit within forest basins and potentially at risk of damaging fragile ecosystems as they expand. So we do look more broadly. That said, that is certainly an area where additional research is required to look at those broader interlinkages. Does that help? Great.
Okay, anything to add?
I could perhaps on the first question, just to highlight that I think that, I mean, of course, just to highlight that perhaps, this report was preceded by a 9 months research. And I think that it is important to highlight that throughout that research, no primary information was produced. So one of the conditions from which we departed was the idea that we have to make sense of existing data. And that was quite an important condition in the sense that, it's very easy to go for the ideal indicator and the ideal set of indicators. But when you don't have data that is comparable and robust across a large number of cities, that's not a very useful exercise. So that put us in the decision, if you want, confronted us with having to make the decision of what cities were we going to sample to show the scope of the framework that was put forward. So of course there might be many crucial omissions, but the report doesn't claim to be comprehensive in the sense of telling us everything about every city. In relation to your second question, I think that that's precisely perhaps one of the main strengths of the report, in the sense that it takes policymakers and decision makers to think beyond the built-up area. It says, look, there's no way you can proof your city, future-proof your city by just, retrofitting your buildings and so on. You need to look at the wider urban region, but also at virtual flows. I mean, the issue of virtual water, the issue of there are many flows that are not even sorted out, controlled or managed within the boundaries, not just of the region, but even of the nation. So the message is very strong on that, but I agree with Nick that there is plenty of room to do more on that.
I think it's just interesting just to reinforce actually the level of work the guys have got through in practically 9 months is quite incredible. So the great thing is a model that can be used for other areas when we've got available data and time. Yes, please.
Hi. I'm really excited to read this report. I work in urban resilience, and I think it's a really interesting area. It's certainly one that in Asia is becoming more and more critical. So I think you guys have done a fabulous job of putting it together. I had just one question, and it sort of goes to what you were saying, which is that there's this sort of interconnected story that we're looking at. And we've talked a little bit about urban poor, and I was wondering I don't know if this is in the report, and maybe I could ask you to unpick a little bit, whether the kinds of suggestions that we're thinking about for future-proofing cities also talk to different socioeconomic groups, and if so, what maybe you see that kind of communication being?
Nick, do you want to crack off on
absolutely.
that one?
It's a challenging question. The way we've looked at this in the context of the report is to say we've looked at different cities and we've looked at their different vulnerabilities to environmental risks. And you'll see we've looked at vulnerability in terms of the number of people living in acute poverty. We've looked at access to basic services, etc. And what we've done is we've assessed over 100 policies to say which of those policies are most effective at targeting the urban poor, people that are living in poverty, people that have poor access to basic services, which policies are most effective in helping those types of people and communities. We've also then looked at policies that can also improve wider livability and might be more applicable to cities which have largely solved the acute poverty problem. So what we've done is we've looked quite broadly and qualitatively assessed different policies so that those working in cities can start to look at those that are going to be most effective at addressing their specific needs. Does that help?
Okay.
Perhaps just to add to that, I think that your question can be answered in relation to two aspects, which, I think that we were aware all the time of perhaps how difficult it is to provide a precise and real picture of who is really at risk and who is going to get, the worst of the scenarios that we were looking at without going into a much more disaggregated level. So what we did, I think that the report settles for trying to give at least quite a comprehensive idea that cities, are not just, don't have an average, level per capita, but the spatial location of, who you are and where you live matters a lot in relation to how vulnerable you will be to environmental risk. Now, we do accept, and I think that it is very important to highlight, that there is room for much more disaggregation on that. Just to say, for instance, that we are very aware that it's not just about whether, your relations, your ranking, how you rank in terms of poverty indexes or your level of income or what part of the city you live, but whether you are a tenant or a landlord in an informal settlement will make a huge difference, probably, as to, how secure is your access to key resources and so on. So there are many more nuanced, readings that need to be done at the city level, and we hope that this is precisely one of the areas in which the further work is taken. But I think that the other aspect is not only the vulnerability, but also the capacity to act. We try to highlight that it doesn't just matter, we don't just need to look at the capacity to act by, governments, local and national governments, the private sector, but also civic society and very much the poor themselves. So again, there is room to disaggregate much more, what are the capacities to act in place.
If I may, I'll just add briefly to what Adriana has been mentioning. I mean, we do look at, as Adriana has pointed out, we do look at the different capacities of cities to act. So we looked at the strength of their governance, planning systems and their finance and delivery systems, and that's really important, and working out which policies are most applicable to different types of cities. I think a second point I make, which is really important, what Adriana's raised, is that at the end of the report, we do make the point that cities will need support in taking forward these approaches. They will need support in helping to undertake diagnostics of the risks they face, and looking at that in quite some detail, both temporally and spatially, because and so you'll see that outlined in the conclusions of the report.
I think that was probably quite comprehensive. Has that covered your question? Excellent. Yes, sir.
Yes, Adrian Greenman from New Civil Engineer. I just wondered if you could comment on something from the first world, actually, which is New York and what happened to New York recently, and whether there are any implications from what you say for them or lessons to learn from what happened in New York. And maybe a second question, what about the reports this morning about developing on land in the UK and the greenbelt?
Okay, who would like to tackle that one first?
I'm happy to
have
a go. New York, really interesting. I mean, the latest figure suggests that New York, the cost of Hurricane Sandy is over $60 billion already. Massive impacts, transport systems, energy systems, huge damage, etc. Whilst this report obviously looks at the challenges facing cities in developing countries, I think the approach and the concepts that we've outlined are more broadly applicable. Cities globally face very significant risks in relation to climate hazards, which we've seen in New York, significant risks in relation to water security, food security issues, etc. So I think, in answer to your point, the focus of the report is very clearly developing cities in developing countries, but I think the approaches and ideas that we put forward are more broadly applicable. I think, secondly, on your point about greenbelt, I think the report focuses very clearly on cities in developing countries, and I don't think we're able to comment at this stage on the specifics of the UK situation.
Anything you would want to add, Roger, in terms of the... Yep. If we can have another mic. Is there a mic flying around? There we are. Look at that. Well done.
Thank you. I think certainly... Shall I stand up? Yes, I think certainly on the greenbelt question, I think the dynamics of developing cities are very different to the situation in the UK. Obviously, one of the types of policies that we've investigated in the report is around the green infrastructure for cities, and particularly the need to look more widely at cities and their catchments in terms of the river corridors and the natural ecosystems that cities are embedded within. So I think some of the types of policies that we've covered in the report certainly look at that, and in the developing world, that's certainly going to be critical in terms of growing those cities sustainably.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Has that covered your points? Anything to add, Adriana, or they're covered?
Perhaps I can just say that there is, I think, again, without commenting on the UK green belt policy, I think that there is a very strong parallel with efforts that are seen across cities in the global south in relation to two key spatial land use policies. One is redensification, and another one has to do with the idea of spatial containment through methods, means like the green belt and others.
Okay. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to ask questions? There's one that crops up to me. Is there a model example of a city that you think is closest to thinking through future proofing?
Again, a challenging question.
You'll kill me then.
I think we've outlined in the report quite a significant number of cities which we believe are pursuing an approach which is consistent with future proofing. I think we've mentioned Bangalore. Bangalore is investing heavily in things like new metro systems to improve mobility and to bring affordable transport to the very poorest. It's investing in low carbon and energy efficient buildings, congestion reduction system, etc. I think we've looked at cities also which have lower capacities, such as Maputo, which are investing in things like coastal infrastructure to prevent flooding and cyclones. We see examples in Bangkok, which obviously was very badly affected by flooding in 2010, over $40 billion worth of damage there alone. They have a comprehensive action plan, the Bangkok Action Plan, which outlines a wide range of measures to reduce carbon emissions and energy use and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there's a lot of interesting lessons there. We also see cities like Karachi, which have profound risks in relation to water security and food security, investing in things like, as Adrian has mentioned, groundwater, protection of groundwater sources, and also urban agriculture to help improve and bolster food supply. So there are examples. There are many examples. I think one of the things that we've said in the report is missing, that often cities do not take enough advantage of taking an integrated approach, looking at these issues together, because many of the policies for future-proofing can not only respond to specific environmental risks, such as they can also generate economic and social returns, and also often tackle other risks as well. And I mentioned, the built environment and water and waste are good examples and good entry points for that.
Okay, thank you. You've answered my question. From the floor.
Hi, thank you very much. It really looks a very interesting project. I look forward to reading the report. I'm from Climate Asia, also research and communications project on climate change in 7 countries in Asia. And I'm interested in 2 things. One is the methodology. You said you've used secondary data and what type of data and the challenges you faced. And the other is on the concept of future-proofing as opposed to resilience or adaptive capacity. What are your thoughts on these concepts and whether there's an agreement or disagreement on where they are useful or not? Thank you.
Who wants to shoot first? Is that you again?
Do you want to go on the data?
I'm happy to. Yeah, and I can hand over. In terms of the methodology, you're of course right. There's profound difficulties in collecting data. Indeed, one of the main recommendations of the report is that greater effort should be made by the international agencies, United Nations, World Bank, etc., to collect data on the environmental risks facing cities. We had huge challenges pulling together data. We used a variety of geospatial data from CISON and also from reputable sources globally to pull together what we believe is quite a unique data set. The data is not great, and we do believe greater investment is needed in that space, and hopefully DFID and others will be starting to think about those issues moving forward in conjunction with their partners. I think the second point is a really good question in relation to resilience and future-proofing. I think resilience is really crucial. Resilience really talks about, it suggests a lack of ability to cope, essentially. And what we've said in future-proofing is future-proofing's about more than that. It's about how do cities respond proactively to the risks they face so that they can implement policies which not only respond to the risks they face but generate social and economic benefits as well. So I think resilience is important. It is important for cities to be resilient. That said, I think it's also important that cities build on that and are actually proactive in responding to risks. Yeah. Adrian, do you want to add anything to that?
No, just to highlight that in relation to the first question, I think that it is very useful as well to take this as a survey of the data gaps that we have, because there is an important measure. And we shouldn't just settle down for, like a proxy way of understanding very important and complex issues. So a lot of work to be done there in terms of really developing more robust and consistent and comparable databases across our cities in the Global South. In terms of the second point, I agree with Nick. I think that future-proofing is perhaps slightly more ambitious than, more aspirational than the notion of resilience, in the sense that it's trying to think, to get us to think not just how we can bounce back, how we can cope, but how can we even aspire to take a transformative approach to how our cities are going to work and for whom. I just got a sense you were going to answer my question. Yeah. So go on. No, I just thought that with regards to the question, the previous question from David about, are there any best cases that we should be looking at? I think that we purposely try to move away from the idea of suggesting best practices. This is something quite common, no? In most of, when we look at environmental planning and management approaches, we very often appeal to, resort to this idea of, okay, who is getting it right and can we do it? And I think that once, say for instance, I don't know how many of you have heard, if if we were to ask how many cities are really best practices, Curitiba will come to everybody's mind, perhaps nowadays Medellin, and there is really a handful of cities that seem to be presented under so extraordinary conditions, no? Very enlightened mayors, a high capacity to act, and so on. So this can be very alienating from cities who are not featuring those aspects. And this is why we try to take some distance from the idea of a best practice approach. And rather than saying, okay, rather than looking and trying to emulate what seems to be working somewhere else under conditions that you might not have, why not to equip you with elements to think about, what can be done from your current capacity to act, which of course can be developed over time.
Interesting. Okay. Yes, sir. Oh, okay. You first.
Thank you. Andrew Dowding from Bay Cities. A relatively untechnical question. You clearly done a fantastic job at outlining the scale of the challenge and produced some really good recommendations about how to go forward. But I just thought at the end of the report, when that 9 months of very intensive work had finished and you had immersed yourself in all these cities and the issues, whether on a human level you were hopeful for what might happen. So do you think we can rise to the scale of this challenge and deliver, particularly given political and funding constraints that cities face across the world, not least the UK?
If I could I'll just give a little view on that. I think you have to always be hopeful that you can find solutions. I think the sort of thinking here, helps move on current thinking, and there's opportunities there as well as mitigating risks. Yeah? The issues about how you get effective collaboration between parties to make it work, I think, is often one of the bigger challenges. And I always like seeing some of the examples that are right in front of us, the collaboration here between government, university and business has worked extremely effectively to actually come forward with a new thought process that I think has real application. So, yeah, I'm always hopeful that the challenges that we face, those sort of thought processes and those collaborations and showing examples of it, are things that can generate and spark confidence across the place for other people to sort of emulate, copy, move forward. Otherwise, we may as well go to the beach, which doesn't feel too good. Any other comments you want to make?
Yeah, I'd just echo David's point, which is I think it's important to be optimistic. I certainly don't feel in despair after being involved so heavily in this report. I think what we've seen is that cities are taking action. I think we've seen leadership by cities, actually. Cities have moved quicker and faster than national governments in many instances. We've seen funding agencies, World Bank, ADB, starting to recognise this issue and putting investment in there. The multilateral development banks put together a commitment at Rio, where I think they were planning to invest $175 billion over the next 10 years in sustainable transport, which will be primarily in the world cities. The World Bank made a commitment with the C40 initiative to make finance more directly available to cities. So we are starting to see movement from cities and from international agencies. And so I'd really echo what David said. I think it's important to be optimistic. Yeah.
Perhaps I mean just to add the same. I think that definitely we shouldn't be pessimistic. I don't feel depressed either. But I agree. I think that you are hinting to the point that we shouldn't be naive. And I hope we try to convey that message as well. We are not trying to oversimplify and saying, just that this is an easy task. I think that it is feasible, it's doable as long as we keep on doing our jobs, all of us, no? You in terms of communication, others in terms of planning, researching, and so on. If we keep on doing it well and thinking in a strategic way, I think that, yes, it is challenging, but doable.
I think organisations like your own actually help in that as well. So any more questions from the yes, sir. Yep.
You mentioned briefly the private sector. I was just wondering what role businesses have in future-proofing, because presumably there is huge opportunities for new services and products and stuff like that in terms of getting this to happen.
Okay, Nick, do you want to have a first shot?
Sure.
I think there's two elements to this. Firstly, that many private sector companies, nationally and multinationally, are investing in cities all around the world, energy systems, water systems, transport systems, etc. And those stakeholders who made it clear in the report need to be aware of the risks long term to their investments and the performance of those assets that they own and manage and deliver in cities. And I think some of the approaches and that we've outlined in the report can help private sector companies to do that and raise greater awareness of that. I think the second point you've raised, which is a really interesting one, and it's also something we've highlighted in the report, which is this is a tremendous opportunity for business to help work with cities to develop solutions to some of these profound challenges. And we already see that. The private sector is heavily involved in a lot of the cities that we've assessed in helping develop new creative solutions to low-carbon buildings, to water conservation measures, etc. And so it's a really important opportunity. I think that it requires business, government and funding agencies to work together to make that happen.
Anything to add, Adrian?
Yeah, just to add that perhaps it is also important to look at the wider spectrum of the private sector that we usually play. And I think that when we look at some of the cases that we examine in more depth, it's fascinating to see the huge and very long chains of private sector operators, all the way from international companies to even informal, people working in the informal economy that do provide answers to to very large percentages of the population, of the most vulnerable groups. I'm thinking about food provision, water supply, sanitation, and so on. There is a lot happening already.
Does that cover your point? Yep, excellent. And how are we doing? Anybody left? Have we exhausted the questions? Looks like it.
Can I just, I
Sure.
wanted to make a final point as well, actually, which is, and it comes to this point about optimism. Can we do this? I think what we've seen through this is a unique partnership between one of the world's largest infrastructure and development companies, one of the premier universities in the world, and one of the most well-respected development agencies, DFID. And so that gives me hope. I'd also like to mention, this wouldn't have been possible either without the foresight of DFID as an agency in starting to think through these issues and underscoring the importance of urbanisation, underscoring the importance of factors like climate change and how that might impact the world's poor. And so I just wanted to say thank you as well to DFID colleagues who are here today, who have helped shape the work and really saw a gap and helped us collectively take it forward. So, yeah.
Okay. Adriana, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Fully endorse the thanks to DFID and to the people that we have the pleasure to work with, who really push us and kept us on our toes all the time, and contributed a lot. And also very much to Atkins for leading such a fantastic process. Thank you.
Okay, so we commend the joint working by the three parties. Especially thank you very much to all those involved. Huge amount of hard work. Thank you very much to Adriana and Nick for being on the spot and asking questions. And finally, I commend you to read the report. It is an easy read. It's fascinating. Take it home and read it tonight. So thank you very much, ladies and gents. Now, really happy if you'd want to hang back and just get a tad of food and continue the conversation. Thank you for coming. Well done.